let's all stand. Please be seated.
Dr. Quadrio, are there any specific effects from abuse by a clergy on a child or subsequently an adult's view of spirituality?
Yes, that's a very important aspect and a particular aspect of abuse within a religious context because, especially with young children, see a priest or a member of the clergy as someone who's close to God, really. And so the sense of betrayal is particularly shattering because it's kind of like not just one bad person, but it feels like, well, maybe God's bad. And the loss of faith and the shattering of the belief is really very damaging to a child. And if a child grows up feeling, well, you can't trust anybody and everybody's bad and even God's bad, that's what I mean about the profound characterological damage that can have. And also, it's very important because usually the child's family is, or their entire community may be strongly affiliated with this particular religion. And that means that when children make disclosures, they very often get a bad reception and told they're lying, it can't be true. And the negative response from family and community can just really compounds the damage enormously.
What about when a child is asymptomatic and then the sleeper effect applies and they remember and disclose much later on? Does that have a similar effect on their spirituality?
Yes, it does. Yeah. The long delay doesn't make any difference. It will still shatters one's belief, and it's very disturbing to the sense of identity because you may, for example, have a child who's been abused at, let's say, for argument's sake, maybe between the ages of 5 and 7, and then they go into a period of 4 or 5 years where they seem to be going okay, they don't even think about it anymore, and then something triggers and it all comes out. They also have this very, very damaging experience of it's as if that part of my life is just false. That whole part of my life is just a lie. It's the whole thing. So everything they established as part of their identity just suddenly falls away from them because they just feel like it's not only the abuse years, but all the subsequent years suddenly just seem to mean nothing anymore. And so they can be profoundly, have a sense of alienation from themselves, which is really damaging to be feeling alienated from yourself.
Before the break, you were giving evidence about suicidality and the increased number of suicides from people who were abused as children. Leaving that to one side, what other effects are there on the longevity of those who have been sexually abused as children?
They don't live as long as children who have not been traumatised. So trauma has it's not just a psychological damage, it's a real physical damage. So they have more illness. They have more real illness. On top of that, they often have unhealthy lifestyles, so they're prone to substance abuse and poverty and unemployment. So they're factors that on top. And all of that adds up to something like 10 to 20 years less life for a child who's been traumatised. So there's an enormous morbidity in terms of physical ill health and psychological ill health.
You've referred to grooming throughout your evidence this morning. What are the particular and more common characteristics of grooming?
Well, as I said, the children in institutions often aren't particularly groomed because they're already captive. They don't need to be groomed. Sometimes they're just subject to the authority of the offenders. In the community, the grooming, you can see grooming that's really quite complicated, and there can be very, very careful grooming. teachers, for example, often there's very careful grooming. And the grooming is not just grooming a child, we talk about grooming the family, grooming the community. So an offender can establish themselves as a very, very respected and maybe much loved member of the community or the school or the organisation, and they go to a lot of trouble to really establish themselves in that way. Children abused by clergy, often the clergy befriend the family, visit the family, have dinners in the family home. All of that is in that way. Children abused by clergy, often the clergy befriend the family, visit them through.
Yeah. You've indicated earlier that there's no one profile of an offender who's a sexual abuser. What characteristics are there, however, that apply to offenders of children?
Well, yes, there's no particular profile. They are attracted to areas where they'll have access to children. Obviously, if a person has that kind of sexual interest, they'll want to work with children, so they are attracted to areas where they have access to children. And they're often quite adept at grooming the community and grooming the organisation, so that they're quite well respected and often quite functional in their jobs. They're not dysfunctional in any way. They might actually, so that they're quite respected for what they're doing. Then looking at their sexual orientation itself, a considerable number of them will be what's sometimes called a true pedophile, in that they're exclusively attracted to children. They're not interested in other relationships. Some will abuse children but also have adult relationships as well. That's sometimes true of ministers in the community, not so much, obviously with Catholic priests it's not so true.
Sorry, true of?
Ministers in the,
ministers.
Yes, ministers in the community, often they'll have relationships that in some of the religions where priests can marry, they're married but still abusing children. But the majority that you see especially in the Catholic context, tend to be people who really have fairly much an exclusive orientation towards children. There's a reasonably high level of substance abuse amongst offenders, so they're often using alcohol usually. I mean, a socially accepted substance abuse, if you like, rather than recreational drugs or anything like that. But yes, they don't have any particular profile, and they're not particularly psychopathic either. So they don't come to anyone's attention for breaking rules in other ways or breaking the law, and they usually are very good at establishing themselves and being accepted.
You've spoken in terms of the true pedophile. Are there also opportunistic offenders?
Yes, there are.
How do they work?
If people don't have access to regular kind of usual sexual relations, for example, in prison, men in prison have sex with each other who wouldn't be the least bit interested in sex with other men when they're out of prison, but that's a situation where they don't have any option. Or sometimes if people are having contact with children where it hasn't been a particular predilection of theirs in the past, the fact that the children are there and there's a lot of physical contact with them, they find that the opportunity has arisen and they take advantage of it. But they may not be people who normally seek out children to have sex with.
Are there any other characteristics?
Sometimes offenders are people who are not functioning well, but that's a minority. The ones who are not functioning well, not getting along well, and sort of immature and turn to a relationship with a child because they're not feeling able to conduct a more adequate relationship with another adult. But they do tend to be the minority.
And that's a general immaturity, emotional and sexual immaturity?
Yes, yeah.
You, I understand, have been involved in some treatment programs for offenders in the past?
Yeah, I worked in the prisons for a number of years, and we had offender programs in New South Wales. There was a number of offender programs, so I'm familiar with the offender programs that we have.
The current offender programs in New South Wales? How successful are they? Not
terribly, I have to say. difficulty, and it's especially difficult with religious, in religious contexts, is that in order for someone to be a good prospect for rehabilitation, they need to be willing to admit what they've done and to have some genuine sense of remorse or contrition and to be motivated to do differently. And these people don't fit into that category. Usually by the time it comes to light, the usual reaction to the disclosure is to deny, no, it didn't happen. And then usually after that there comes vilification of the victim. So the victim's lying, the victim's bad, the victim's manipulative, the victim's whatever. So by the time you've been protesting your innocence for a long time and then vilifying the victim, you're not really the ideal person for rehabilitation, who's supposed to be willing to admit what they've done and feel some contrition for it. So it's very hard to come back from that position that you've got yourself into. And it's true of offenders even outside of the church. The usual reaction is denial and blame the victim. And that's not good prospects for rehabilitation. And even if you do get them into a rehabilitation program, in the case of people who really have an exclusive orientation towards sex with children, it's very hard to change people's sexual orientation. So you really need to have someone who's motivated to change. So it's not easy.
What form of treatment are you talking about?
In the prisons in New South Wales, they use an offender program, which is about first of all trying to move the offender into the position where they accept responsibility for it and stop blaming the victim, that they accept that it was entirely their own responsibility, trying to get them to develop empathy, have some sense of the harm that they've done and what the victim must have experienced, and then to focus on ways of changing their behaviour and ways of having more adaptive relationships. But it's not easy.
Do you keep success rates in relation to offending of those in prison?
Their success rates are not good.
Are they indicated by them leaving prison and whether or not they're back in the prison system for similar offending?
You in order to get into one of these programs, you already have to be totally committed to rehabilitation, so that eliminates actually a whole lot of them. And you have to be willing to admit guilt, and that eliminates quite a few. About 50% of people in prison tell you that they didn't do it, whatever it is that they've been convicted of, they didn't do it. And that's certainly true of sex offenders, they didn't do it, or the child lied, or whatever. So you get down to only a minority who will accept responsibility and commit themselves to a treatment program.
And the treatment program involves intensive counselling?
Yeah. Yes, they have a treatment and an offender program they go into, and it's about 4 months, the program, and then if they complete the program, then they're eligible for parole.
And when you indicated the success rate was low, is that because there is a percentage of those who, when released, commit similar offences and then come back in?
There's a significant recidivism rate, and we've already selected the best prospects, and even with those best prospects people, there's a significant recidivism rate, yes.
You left the prison system in the early 2000s?
2001 I left, yeah.
What's changed from then till now in terms of offender treatment?
Not a lot.
No new learnings?
No, I think that the programs are fairly similar. The difficulty is the prisons are getting fuller and fuller. So it's harder and harder to deliver good psychological services. There's an awful lot of mental health morbidity in prisons. The majority of prisoners have been sexually abused as children. So if you wanted to deal with complex trauma in the prison, you'd need an army of psychologists to move into the prisons because, the incidence of child abuse and trauma in their backgrounds is enormous. It's something like 60 to 80%.
That's based on both research and your experience? 60 to 80%? And that's sexual abuse as a child?
Developmental trauma.
Familial and institutional?
Both. Most of the men in prison have had traumatic childhoods, either physical, sexual, psychological abuse of some sort. It's very prevalent. It's just one of those sad things. One of the difficulties that really is a huge difficulty in our society is that for whatever reason, and it's very complicated, I won't go into it, for whatever reason, little boys seem to be predisposed to become externalisers, and little girls are predisposed to become internalisers, meaning that if a little boy is upset, he's more likely to show it in an overt way, become overactive, become temper tantrums, become something acting out, externalising. Little girls are more likely to internalise, meaning getting sad, scared, withdrawing, that sort of thing. It's not exclusive. Boys can be withdrawn and girls can be angry, but it tends to be a very strong difference. Problem with that is that by the time a boy's 11 years old and externalising, people just see him as a bad kid, and then he's set for delinquency in the prisons. A little girl at 11 is seen as sad, fearful, anxious, whatever, and she's set for psychiatric services rather than the prison. And it's really sad because we end up with a huge amount of mental health difficulties in men being channelled into prisons where there is not adequate rehabilitation services and not adequate treatment. And 11% of men in prison have got a psychotic illness, which is not a place to be treating someone with a psychosis. And most of those men with psychotic illness have got a history of childhood trauma. So it's just one of those sad things about the way our society functions, that we, once you put the bad label on a boy, it sticks. And once he does something really bad, like hurt someone, then, you know, any sympathy or understanding of his trauma gets lost. And it's just, you know, lock him up and throw away the key is the general feeling in the community.
You gave evidence earlier about the effect of trauma on the development of the brain, including memory, and you also gave evidence about flashbacks. In your clinical experience, does repressed memory play any role in people seeing you who have been abused sexually as children?
Memory is a really important part of trauma. As I think I said earlier, that the strange thing about trauma is there's this combination of remembering too much and not remembering enough. So there'll be patches of memory missing, and then there'll be experiences that just are burned into the mind and the person can't get rid of them. And it varies. Some people are just full of imagery and they're tormented by it, and other people have huge blanks. There's been a lot of controversy in the area of memory, a huge amount of controversy. So there's suppressed memory, repressed memory and recovered memory. First of all, we have to accept that part of the definition of what trauma is about is that it's a disturbance of memory. So that's fundamental. There is some disturbance of memory in trauma. Recovered memory is a very controversial area where people have claimed to have absolutely no memory whatsoever of the abuse, and they go into treatment or counselling and suddenly it comes back. And there have been instances where it's been suggested by the therapist, and so then the whole area became muddied with accusations. And of course you're dealing with a community that's very quick to discredit victims anyway. And some of it probably has been bad counselling, but the context, of course, is that the community is always willing to discredit the victim. So it easily becomes a case, oh, that's recovered memory, so don't count any of that. What I see a lot of is what I think you call suppressed memory. There are a lot of people, and boys more than girls, who just decide, I'm not going to think about that, I'm putting it out of my mind, I'm just going to get on with my life, I'm not going to deal with this. And some people can do that more effectively than others. So in that case, it's a suppressed memory. So you may then get the situation where the person said, I forgot all about it, and then something's happened to trigger it. But if you sit down and very carefully go over it with them, you find that they never actually didn't know that it happened. They just managed very effectively to just not think about it at all, maybe for years and years and years and years. But if you go over it carefully, you find that actually they always did know. If you'd ever sat down with them and said, well, listen, what happened when you were 7 years old and going to Boy Scouts? They would have said, oh, yeah, well, I remember. But they just haven't given it any thought. So it's suppression. And then repressed memory is a bit more complicated. That's supposed to be a psychological mechanism. It's a controversial area whether your memories can actually be deliberately buried as a way of protecting yourself. There are some people who think that repression is possible and others who don't. But certainly suppression is very common. But people, I mean, ordinary people do it every day. I mean, we all do it. We all say, look, I'm not thinking about that. Nothing I can do about it. I'm not going to think about it anymore. And if you can do that effectively, then some people can actually put something behind them and move on.
That would affect significantly when, and indeed if, a person discloses what happened to them as a child.
Yes. Yes, well, it's more likely that the disclosure will come sometimes it comes as a shock to the person because they have spent so much of their life just kind of keeping it buried and not thinking about it. And then once they start to talk about it, they sometimes feel shocked themselves at the intensity of what they're feeling. And that's when people will often say, you know, I'd forgotten all this, but you actually hadn't forgotten it. You actually had found a very effective way of keeping it completely bottled up. Sometimes it's totally bottled up. There's no evidence that the person's troubled. Other times they say it's bottled up, but it's actually leaking out in little ways that you can see. Little ways like they never stay in a relationship very long, or they don't relate very well to their children, or you know, and it's leaking out, if you like, in those ways, but they don't put it together in their minds. They don't stop and think, well, the reason why I'm not getting on very well in my life is because of all that.
In your evidence so far, you've spoken of the need for trauma-informed counselling and those who have sufficient skills and qualifications at it. You've spoken of the need for more mental health resources in prisons for those who have been abused as children. What other areas of support do you think survivors need?
We have to be much more mindful of symptoms in children than we are as a community. It's a very common scenario that I see. I see kids who are troubled, and they tend, in my experience, they tend to be about 11 years old by the time they get to see a psychiatrist. And then you sit down and go into it, and you find out that this little kid was banned from preschool for biting other children, and the family just felt embarrassed and ashamed, which compounds the child's feelings of shame, and just moved to another kindergarten. And then you just get this history of all these little phenomena over the years, and people have said, oh, look, it's just he's just a hyper kid, he's got ADHD, he's got this, he's got that, he's got something, he's got dyspraxia, he's got learning disorder. The labels proliferate, and the treatments proliferate, and the medication proliferates, and nobody really stops and thinks something's happened to this kid. And then by the time they're 11 years old, it can be really hard to turn them around, and that's what's sad about boys, because by the time they're 11, they're angry and they're big. And now people are starting to feel intimidated by them. And the general approach then is, you know, just put them away somewhere. And you've missed the boat, because we need to deal with these kids when they're littler and when they're already symptomatic, and not say this is just a bad kid, or this is just ADHD, or this is just, you know, a hyper kid, or this is reaction to cordials, or whatever theory of the day happens to be around, and there's always a theory of the day.
And those children would probably see GPs as a first port of call.
Yep.
So it's GPs who need to be made better aware of symptoms that might indicate some underlying abuse.
The whole community needs to be aware that when children are symptomatic, there's a reason. Children are actually very rational creatures. They're not irrational creatures. There's a tendency to say, well, you know, he or she's just a child, as if, well, you know, children are very rational creatures. If you stop and think about why is this child symptomatic and why they've got these particular symptoms, then usually there's something there.
So in addition to GPs, it may well be teachers who would be able to observe this behaviour in children?
I think the community generally, teachers, psychologists, counsellors, GPs, there needs to be just a huge amount of awareness that children who are troubled for a reason. There's so much gobbledygook going on about this disorder or that disorder, or this allergy or that allergy, or whatever. Sometimes it is, but, you know, an awful lot of child distress gets ignored or covered up, or gets channelled into all kinds of treatments.
So looking then at trauma-informed counselling, you were asked questions earlier about the need for some form of accreditation system so that survivors know that they're going to see somebody who's properly qualified and experienced. Are there other forms of counselling that would provide a similar service for survivors?
There are a lot of survivor organisations that are very helpful. The support that people get from other survivors is really important. Finding other people who've been through the same experience is a great comfort. It makes you feel like you're not alone. And also you have people you can talk to who really do understand what you've been going through. So survivor organisations are very helpful. And also survivors get to be cluey about who's who in town and who you can talk to and who you can't talk to. So you get good advice from other survivors about which psychologist to see and which one not to see, and which doctor to go to and which one not to go to. So all that's really important for survivors. So I think the organisations, the self-help and the support groups have been really good. And also the support groups have been wonderful in lobbying the professions to change what they're doing.
In your clinical experience, do you think...
So the support groups have been wonderful in lobbying the professions to change what...
Someone, when that someone was paid for by the institution where they're abused?
That's been one of the problems of the attempts at redress made by the institutions. I think you have to get the help. Maybe the institutions can pay the bill, but that's all. They shouldn't be providing the treatment. No.
So they provide the money, and there's an independent administration as to
absolutely
funding of counselling and the like, as well as any redress.
It's a bit like psychiatric research is run by drug companies, and that's straight up. you know the results are going to be skewed, and they are. Same thing with it has to be separate from the money, otherwise it gets skewed.
In addition to having a clinical practice and doing the research and speaking engagements that you've spoken of, do you also do assessments of offenders for courts?
Yeah.
Who approaches you to do those generally?
I did most of it when I was in prison. When I was working in prison. Since I've been out of prison, I do them occasionally, but I don't do a lot. I've got a reputation for being on the side of the victims.
Well, I was wondering about that.
That compromises me.
So who approaches you generally now?
Sometimes I am approached to assess more often with familial abuse.
And do you consider that an important part of your work in the profession as providing that service?
I always felt it was really important. I was interested in the prison situation because seeing the amount of trauma in prisons is really important. So the sex offenders are difficult to help, but in prison the sex offenders aren't the big group. The big group of offenders in prison are other kinds of offenders. So it's been important to work in that context to see the effect of trauma on their trajectories. And as I said, I do a lot of family assessments, and that brings me into contact with family members who abuse other members and children who abuse other children and adolescents. But the institutional abusers, no, I've not been, I'm not the favourite person to assess them.
Do you think that survivors might feel difficulties in being counselled by somebody who also provides assessment for offenders?
I think it needs to be kept very separate.
And it's not necessary for your ongoing development as a psychiatrist to have that component, just using you as an example in your work?
I felt it was necessary for me to have that. And I think it's necessary in one's training to have both, so that you don't just see one side of this.
Thank you. Thank you. I have nothing further.
Yes, Doctor, can I just take up with you a couple of issues that you've spoken about? You've talked in general terms about what we've come to understand as the various barriers to children disclosing. So you've given evidence about those feelings of shame and guilt. And can I ask you just to focus for a moment on the issue of children worrying about not being believed. We've heard a considerable amount about that as being a barrier to disclosure. In child developmental terms, what do you think is going on for the child who is concerned that he or she won't be believed if they disclose?
Well, I think children are intuitively correct. They have an awareness, and they're correct because children are often not believed. And they certainly have an intuitive understanding of what their parents will and will not accept. So there's that kind of intuitive level of understanding. And the children who do disclose often realise that they've got parents who are going to be supportive. But if a child intuitively realises that the family is not going to be willing to listen, then they won't disclose. And then the shame and the guilt and the self-blame is also part of that.
So is it your view that part of that is the impact of what we've been referring to this morning as the grooming process?
Well, for example, the child might be well aware that their parents admire the offender. If in the case of the church, for example, if mum and dad are firm believers in the church and committed to the faith, then the child realises that it's very hard to destabilise that system, and that mum and dad probably won't want to know about this. If there's been grooming of the family, like when the offender has actually become part, a visitor to the family home and that sort of thing, it becomes very difficult.
Thank you. And again, with respect to the grooming process, we've heard a considerable amount of evidence about denigration, humiliation and physical abuse being perpetrated on children in conjunction with sexual abuse. Is it your opinion that those forms of abuse are part of the grooming continuum, or are they part of something else that's going on?
When there's frank physical abuse, it's usually children who are in care. And in that case, there's much less grooming that goes on because the child's under the control and the authority of the offender, so they don't have to. They can just force what they want on the child. So there's not much grooming that goes on there. And some of the institutions, especially the ones that if we're looking at
schools,
and also especially looking at institutional care of children prior to the last maybe couple of decades, when corporal punishment of children was much more widely accepted, and so children would be punished physically, sometimes just for not complying with the authority of the offender. I think in the last couple of decades there's much more of a consciousness in the community that punishment's not a way to go with children. But in the days of the Christian brothers that I saw in the 40s and 50s, corporal punishment was just standard, but it was standard in schools. It was standard even in good schools. It was standard to punish children physically.
Thank you. Just a completely separate question. In the course of responding to Ms. Vanessa's questions, you said that, I think it was the 2008 Sydney conference, that you said that some of the faiths said they didn't have a problem. Are you able to tell us which ones they were that took that view?
Well, they've since all had media exposure for having the same problems.
Yes, but which ones in particular you recall?
Well, at the time we approached the Jewish organisation, and they didn't, and the Muslims ones that we approached said that they didn't have a problem too.
Thank you. Can I take you now to resilience? And I think you've given evidence to us about what you called innate resilience. And I understood you to say to us generally that it was your view that resilience in a child was not particularly well understood by your
That's
profession
right. Yep.
at this stage.
Yeah.
Although what I understood was that there was work going on in that area.
We don't understand, not just with children, with adults too, that some people will just bounce back from some horrific experience and others will be crushed by it, and then a whole spectrum in between. So we don't always understand. We know some of the factors that make for resilience. So if you're healthy and intelligent and able and had a good, strong family, upbringing and environment, then you are going to be more hardy than if you're being damaged and abused and neglected and not loved and all those sorts of things. But even so, there's still a kind of innate hardiness or lack of hardiness that sometimes is hard to account for.
And is that work that is currently going on, is that going on in the psychiatric field? In any particular area that you can draw to our attention?
Resilience is something that's being researched all the time, and also looking for what are the correlates, so that, can we see what factors are important in determining resilience, and can we do things to make children more resilient? There are counselling programs now that actually aim at promoting resilience, but there's some sort of innate level of resilience that is hard to account for. But you can give a child an environment that will promote resilience, and you can also provide counselling that will promote resilience.
So you may not be able to answer this, and don't be embarrassed if you can't, but a significant part of our obligation is to make recommendations so that, so far as possible, children aren't abused in the future. Have you got any thoughts as to where we might look, or as to what might be an approach that institutions might take to minimise?
I think whenever children are in institutional care, there's a risk of abuse.
That's so much is plain. What should we be saying to institutions to try and minimise it?
First of all, they have to face up to the fact that it happens in every institution, and I think religious institutions have suffered a little bit in the past from feeling that if we just put good people in charge, then nothing bad will happen. I think we need to think about the way we think about money, for example, is quite different. I mean, we have massive security in banks, and that's not because we think all the people who work in banks are bad people. We just know that human nature being what it is, we've got to keep the money secure. We don't treat children with the same level of, we've got to keep them secure. We do have the assumption that we just get all these nice, good people and put them in charge and everything will be okay. Wouldn't dream of running a bank like that. Just let's find some good people and put them in charge and not worry about security. So you've got to realise that, children are vulnerable to abuse by caretakers, and in institutions they're far more vulnerable, so they need to think about an approach to screening people and keeping transparency in the way the place operates, and an environment where children are free to complain and to be listened to if they have any problems, and not to have authoritarian systems where you shut up and do as you're told, or don't complain. So then children need to have their voices heard, and have sympathetic people who will listen to them. And we just have to keep that level of reality testing that, adults are prone to abuse children in their care. So we have to have scrutiny of these institutions.
I have some questions.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. Professor, following from the Chair's questions to you, the Royal Commission is interested in and is examining the prospects for a public health model with respect to prevention, really, of child sexual abuse. You'd be familiar with the concept, yes? In what respects do you think a public health model approach might facilitate much less abuse and a more secure and more safe environment for children?
Well, I think it's absolutely essential that we have a public health approach, because the biggest risk to children is abuse and violence, and family violence and abuse and trauma. And we have public health approaches to all kinds of illnesses, but the biggest cause of morbidity is right under our noses, and we don't have a public health approach to it. Family violence and abuse and trauma are huge morbidity factors. There's not a psychiatric diagnosis that isn't correlated in some way. 50% of people who are hospitalised with mental illness have a history of childhood trauma. That's, you know, if 50% of people who are hospitalised had a history of drinking cow's milk or whatever, we'd ban it instantly. But we don't have that public health model at all. And the other problem is that because there's not a discrete syndrome, it cuts across all areas. That's also been hard for people. People have these sort of discrete areas. You know, there's this area and that area and the other area. Well, it cuts across all those areas. And the transmission, I haven't mentioned transmission. The transmission of trauma is extremely significant. For example, 40% of boys who grow up in a domestic violence household are likely to become domestic violence perpetrators themselves. Now, there are not many genes that have 40% penetration, and yet there's a massive amount of research money that goes into looking at the gene that causes depression and the gene that causes schizophrenia and the gene that causes ADHD. And we've got causes under our noses that we're not doing anything about, which is that if you brutalise children when they're little, they're going to behave in bad ways when they get bigger.
Professor, we have some ideas about what a public health model might look like, but I'd be interested to know from you, what do you think the main constituent elements of a public health model should be in the area of child sexual abuse?
Understanding, first of all, that childhood abuse, neglect and adversity is the single greatest pathogen that children are exposed to, over and above all other pathogenic influences in our community. If you put together all the problems of childhood adversity, so then you look at poverty, neglect, abuse, violence, all of that, they are the biggest components, and they cost the community a fortune. So it's important that we deal with it as the biggest pathogen. It's not easy to deal with a pathogen that's so widespread and that there's a huge amount of denial about, but we've been able to do it in other areas and we can do it in this area.
A second area I wish to ask you about briefly. You have given evidence about impact arising from child sexual abuse. Would you explain to us what you feel are the differences in impact between abuse by an adult or abuse by an older child on the victim?
Well, if there's a considerable age difference between the victim and the perpetrator, then the fact that the offender is not an adult doesn't make a great deal of difference. We generally define abuse as being when there's more than 3 years difference, or where it's coercive or violent, because there's sexual play that goes on between children that's not abusive. But once a child has been abused by a child who's 3 or more years older, then it pretty much fits into the paradigm of abuse generally.
So the impact would be similar?
It's similar, yeah.
The last area I just wanted to deal with briefly, if you wouldn't mind. Your evidence has concentrated, because that's where the majority of offence lies, on men. Where the offender is a female, an adult female with a child in an institutional context, are there differences that we should note in terms of impact or causality or anything at all?
Again, there's a huge amount of childhood trauma in the background of women who offend. It's really very unusual to find a female offender who hasn't got a history of childhood trauma and abuse herself. and substance abuse is really very common too amongst women, amongst all offenders, but women offenders is often substance abuse as well. Otherwise, and it is unusual for women. It's not that women don't abuse children; they do, but sexual abuse is not much of a modus operandi with women. Women will abuse children physically and psychologically and verbally, but sexual abuse is not so common. But where there is sexual abuse, in my experience, almost always it's a background of the woman having been sexually abused herself. And then there's a smaller group which is always notable, but where they're working in conjunction with a male offender, and occasionally some sort of famous cases, but they're really unusual where they work in conjunction with a male offender.
You have said it's very unusual. We have had evidence at some public hearings, and of course we've also had discussions with thousands of victims where it has been reported to us that women have known that offending by men was going on. Is that, in your experience, a more common
yes,
matter?
I think women have sometimes colluded in that way by not taking action. Sometimes because they're intimidated, but sometimes because, particularly in the church, there's that false view of the good name of the church is really important and will do more harm to the community by disclosing than by covering up. So I think that women have been complicit in that for the variety of motivations, from being complicit to being fearful or fearful of retribution. And there have been nuns who have been very physically abusive towards children in their care. So there are a lot of people I've seen who've had very sadistic experiences with nuns, and occasionally sexual abuse as well by nuns.
Doctor, you know that there are tens of thousands of children in out-of-home care today, and you'll know that there's been a trend towards most out-of-home care being provided in individual homes rather than orphanages. Is there anything you can say to help the Royal Commission understand what is a model for the delivery of out-of-home care that is more protective of children?
Well, there has to be scrupulous screening. I've seen cases of children abused in out-of-home care where, with a little bit of digging around, you find out that the offenders actually had some previous problems. So I think the screening has to be really scrupulous. And the whole idea of children in out-of-home care are very vulnerable to abuse. We need to do a lot more about dealing with family problems, and I think that you have to ensure that a child's safe. You can't leave them in a home where they're being abused. But I don't think enough is done to try to repair families that are not functioning well.
So there should be more early intervention where there are problems before the child's removed.
Sometimes children are removed where I don't think there's been nearly enough effort made to rehabilitate the parents or the mother. I've seen drug offenders are a real problem because treating drug offenders is very hard work. But removing the children and putting them in out-of-home care, it's not a solution either. We need to be a bit cleverer about this.
In cases where it is in the interest of the child to be removed from their family, what is it about out-of-home care that can be more protective than it is now when you understand that most children in out-of-home care are living in individual families? Leaving aside screening, understand what you're saying about screening.
There are lots of families who have provided extraordinarily well for children placed in their care, but still there is a very significant incidence of abuse of children in out-of-home care as well. So I think prevention is that we need to do more at the beginning before. We don't have nearly enough people working in family and community services. Everybody knows that the workers have their work cut out. They can only deal with the worst. There are a number of children every year who die of abuse and neglect and trauma at home because there haven't been services delivered. We're not treating children like the priceless commodity that they really are.
Is there a better model than having children in individual homes?
We don't do nearly enough mother and infant care that we could do. For example, a woman who's not functioning well as a mother, the tendency is to remove the children, even if it's supposed to be on a sort of temporary basis, but that's very damaging to a child anyway. We don't have nearly enough mother and child treatment units. We could put mothers into a treatment unit where they're resident with their children and are treated while they're resident. There's very little of that. There's not even a lot of mother-infant units in New South Wales. That infancy is a very critical time. We're not doing nearly enough to deal with mother-infant problems. We should be trying to get people to be better parents rather than wait till the thing breaks down or the children are abused.
You would agree that the move from the orphanage-style provision of out-of-home care to the current one is preferable?
Well, institutional care is not good for children, no. The sad thing is that children are abused by their own biological parents, but the further you remove a child from the biological parent, the more the incidence of abuse goes up. Until if you have complete strangers looking after children, like in detention centres and so forth, then the rate of abuse just goes higher and higher and higher. Once that kind of bond of attachment is not there between an adult and the child, the risk of abuse becomes very significant.
And if a child has been abused sexually in the familial setting and then is removed and placed in another family, as it were, what are the chances of that child being abused in this placement?
Well, as I said, the further away you go from your biological parents, the more your risk of abuse increases, just as a sort of risk factor. And that's not to say that there aren't lots and lots of foster families and adoptive families that are wonderful, but just looking at sort of raw statistics, the further you are removed, the more likely you are to be abused.
So more resources should be put into early intervention in families that are struggling, and more resources should be put into alternative forms of accommodation, such as you say, mother and infant units.
We have very little in the way of mother infant services and parent-child services. We had a service in Sydney that was an admission unit for children with their families, and that's been wound down till it's. I think the program's not even running anymore. So, and there was only one program in all of Sydney.
There was a program, wasn't there, where Department of Health people visited new parents, particularly mothers, over a period of time to see how they were getting on?
That's a study that hasn't been sufficiently acted upon either. That was by a lot of work done by a particular person called Olds, who did a 15-year study of having home visitors, usually nurses, and they just go to the home where there's it started in pregnancy, had a visit to the mother. They picked vulnerable women like young teen single mums and followed them over a 15-year period with a regular home visit. And the delinquency rates dropped by something like 90% in the ones that had the regular home visitor. So,
is that program across Australia or just in New South Wales?
It's not across Australia, no.
But it's still operating in New South Wales?
No, the Olds didn't work in New South Wales. It's an American study.
Right.
But there have been studies like that show that very good outcomes when you institute some fairly simple things. You know, this is having a regular adult who visits and just is a kind of troubleshooter and a shoulder to cry on if things go wrong, and that makes a huge difference.
Thank you.
Now, does anyone else have any questions? Anyone else at all? No, very well.
I represent two men who gave evidence last week, and they reported and gave evidence of a very...
Can you bring that microphone so you can talk?
They reported and gave evidence which was all too characteristic of the evidence given by the people who have given evidence. One of the things that my clients have discussed is the possibility of a triage or a process at the commencement of counselling whereby they are able to essentially have an audit of their life as it is at that point. The difficulty that they are experiencing is that they are not necessarily the best advocate for their own position. The developmental and psychological and memory issues that you've very clearly identified render the individual only able to self-report a component of what they are experiencing. And there's a good much else which they are not even aware of, which could be ascertained by psychometric testing, by psychiatric assessment, by physical assessment, and by interview with partners and siblings and the like. Is there merit in the proposition, particularly in Ballarat, where we have a large number of people all seeking care and counselling, for a triage system of that type with high quality, highly experienced people conducting the triage, so compiling reports, and then that report being used as a basis for ongoing assessment?
So that kind of prioritises the problems and the needs.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Especially when I think there's been a lot of people in the Ballarat area who've been affected.
And on a second and unrelated issue, you made reference to various assessments that you've conducted. My clients are very concerned about being able to identify or imagine the life that they might have had but for the abuse. And as they learn more and as people listen to and educate themselves in the way of the consequences that you're demonstrating, their notion of the harm ripples out and expands exponentially. So in the process of imagining, or for the purposes of perhaps seeking compensation, they try and imagine what might have been. Is it possible for people in their 40s or 50s to disaggregate the normal vicissitudes of life or other adverse child events from the specific sequelae to childhood sexual abuse? Or is that not something that a psychiatrist...
It's difficult because if you're traumatised as a child, it affects every part of your being. So every part of your being is affected by that experience. So it's not like you can isolate it like just one organ. Not like you just got kidney damage but your liver's working fine. It's like every part of your person is affected by that. So it's really difficult to separate out. It's almost impossible to know what could have been if it hadn't been for the trauma, because every part of your being has been affected by it.
It's difficult. Can useful observations be made from a psychiatric perspective?
Observations about what?
What might have been. What if.
The what if. You know, that question opens up a huge amount of grief for the victim. It's really difficult to deal with because there's a huge amount of grief that goes into just posing the question of what might have been. It's a life lost, it's an identity shattered. It's very difficult to deal with what might have been, and it's unknowable unless... if you're in a family where you've got siblings who were completely unaffected by the trauma, you can sometimes look at your siblings and think, well, you know, roughly I should have, you know, if my brothers have all gone to university or my sisters are all happily married and have beautiful children, then maybe that's what I could have expected that I could have had if I had a different life, but it's only a rough estimate.
Is there some scientific rigour in that analysis, for instance, between siblings?
Roughly, you can say that siblings in a family tend to have similar trajectory, not identical, but similar. So if you look at a family and one child was abused and is grossly affected and the other three all seem to be living fairly secure and stable lives and they've got employment and they've got stable relationships, then you can say, well, there's only one reason why this one's so different from the others.
On a third unrelated point, amongst the Ballarat Survivors Group, which is an informal group, which my two clients are a part of, they have discussed amongst themselves and colloquially they have never come across an instance of someone identifying as having been the subject of childhood sexual abuse and this not being the case. That is to say that their experience is that people would never lie about such a thing. Is there a body of literature about false reportage, and is it...
Yeah, it's unusual.
And it is unusual.
It's unusual. It's unusual not only for children but for adults as well. It's unusual. So, yeah, false allegations are... There has to be a fairly solid motivation for someone to make a false allegation, and considering the amount of trauma that a disclosure brings, and most people realise that that's not an easy path to take. You have to ask yourself, what's the motivation for making a false allegation? Children don't have much motivation at all to make false allegations. Adults sometimes do, but even so, most false allegations of sexual assault in adults are not common either.
Thank you.
No one else? Ms Finners?
Nothing further, Your Honour.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your evidence. You're excused.
Your Honour, I understand my friend has something.
I am saying that.
Yeah, very well. Yes.
And the position is the same in relation to Mr David Ridsdale.
I'm sorry?
The position is the same in relation to Mr David Ridsdale.
Mr Ridsdale will make himself available to be recalled to be cross-examined.
If needed.
Well, Mr Gray?
Well, I hear that. I should say for the record that both of those positions are very different from what was conveyed to us on Friday, but in any event, our position is the same.
You don't wish Mr Ridsdale to be recalled either?
No.
Very well. Ms Finners?
Perhaps we could adjourn till 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, Your Honour, if that's convenient.
10 a.m. in the morning.